Hey everybody, Dave here at Ground Zero, once again talking all things comics. Now, on my last video, Josh Herndon commented, "Hey Dave, really enjoying Rye, would love to know more about the Valiant universe." We love Valiant here, so frankly, that sounds like a great topic for a segment we're calling, interestingly enough. Yes, we're still calling it that. Now, we love Valiant here. We think they are currently publishing some of the best comics. The last, not quite decade, has been just an amazing time for their books and their characters. The Bloodshot movie just hit the stands at just the wrong time to hit theaters, because that was about the time they all started closing. Nonetheless, I hear really good things about it, so this is a wonderful time to talk about the company. Now, to some degree, instead of the characters, I'm going to talk about the behind-the-scenes formation of the company, because frankly, that's a subject I love. I find it fascinating. Now, the story of Valiant is a story of rags to riches to rags to riches. It is a story of brilliant marketing and some really short-sighted, foolish decisions. It is a story of the comic book market boom in the 90s. It is a story of the colossal bust that happened right after. It's an amazing story. It's the story of comics in the 90s. Now, to start it, we're actually going to have to go back to the 60s. Don't panic, everybody. Don't turn the video off. I'm going to catch you up pretty fast. So you ready? Okay, let's go. Now, it all starts with Jim Shooter. Now, Jim Shooter in the 1960s was writing comic books himself at the age of 14. This is actually the first book he wrote. He basically got in touch with DC, sent him samples. They said, "We like your work. Sure, we'll hire you." They didn't know he was 14 years old. Not until after they'd already hired him and started paying him for some of the scripts. He was working steadily, and he created a lot of characters. He created Karate Kid, Pharaoh Lad, the Fatal Five, all sorts of things. He moved up through the ranks doing writing, then eventually went over to Marvel Comics. Now, Marvel Comics was in a strange situation basically during this period. After Stan Lee stepped down as editor-in-chief, Roy Thomas took over. He did a great job for a number of years, but frankly didn't like the job. After he stepped down, they had a succession of great comic professionals that frankly didn't last even 18 months in most cases. Some of them didn't even last a year. It was a horrible job. Trying to balance keeping the comics on schedule with the needs of the artist and all of that kind of stuff just proved too daunting for just about everybody. Until Jim Shooter comes along. Now, Jim Shooter has three particular talents. He is good at making the trains run on time. He can set a schedule and make sure you keep to it. He can be draconian, but he makes things work. Second, he is really good at coming up with innovative product that people want, even if they didn't know they wanted it. He is great at that. 3, he is good at pissing people off. Apparently, if you worked with Jim Shooter or for Jim Shooter or around Jim Shooter, you didn't like the guy. He just had that kind of personality. It probably goes hand in hand with keeping those trains running sharp. Now, while he was at Marvel, he took over at Marvel as editor-in-chief in 1978. Under him, Marvel had some of their most successful years. This was the years of Frank Miller's Daredevil run. This was the year of John Byrne and Chris Claremont's run on X-Men. This was Walt Simonson on Thor. They were doing great things. They were selling a lot of comics. Now, during this period, he came up with several innovations. Now, among them was things like Contest of Champions and Secret Wars. What's great about these? This was the first intercompany crossovers. Jim Shooter basically invented that. So you can blame or bless or curse or whatever it is you want to do with him, because it all really started with him. It was an innovative marketing technique that said, hey, you like this story, buy all this stuff that ties in with it. People did, and at least in those days, they loved it. Next thing, though, as we get to about 1986, that's when things really started to get interesting. Marvel was hitting their 25th anniversary, and so somebody came up with the bright idea of, hey, everybody loves the Marvel Universe, let's start another one. So they did. Now, they put a lot of good talent on it, but the books were met with pretty mixed results. We had Spitfire and the Troubleshooters, Starbrand, we had Justice, I don't know what order is these in, Nightmask, Psylords. Now, take a good look at Psylords, because a lot of these concepts come back into play. Even though the books themselves did not sell very well. In fact, they weren't a dismal failure, but they were not a big success. So after a couple of years, pretty much all those books were gone and forgotten, and you can find them in any comic shop's bargain bin these days. Now, as we get to about 1986, a lot of stuff starts happening. First off, Western Publishing. Now, Western Publishing had been around since the 30s. In the 30s, they licensed a lot of properties. Western Publishing produced things like the little golden books and things like that. They made a lot of stuff with licensing. They licensed products from Walt Disney, from the Edgar Rice Burroughs estate, from movie studios. Most of what they did was licensed to Dell. So all those Dell 4-colors, the Uncle Scrooge comics, all those movie adaptations, Bonanza comics, Man from Uncle, you name it. They licensed it, and they licensed it to Dell. That was up until 1962. And in 1962, they stopped licensing to Dell and started their own comic book arm branch, so to speak, called Gold Key. Gold Key lasted from 62 until 84. And then they just couldn't keep up with their own characters because they didn't have all that many. So in 1986, they go to Marvel and attempt to buy Marvel. Now, the attempt fails, but of course, who were they dealing with? Jim Shooter. Also, towards the end of 86 and going into 87, Jim Shooter basically has to work with another person. That was Steve Mazeroski. Steve Mazeroski was an entertainment mogul. He had managed the Allman Brothers Band. He worked as representing Cyndi Lauper and Aerosmith and a number of other basically entertainment figures. He had gone to Marvel because he was producing a stage show and he wanted to use Marvel characters in that show. And so, of course, in the course of all these negotiations, he deals with Jim Shooter. Now, also over this period, Marvel was losing a lot of people. Marv Wolfman quit, Steve Gerber, Doug Mitch, Gene Colan, John Byrne, very importantly, and Roy Thomas, in many ways the heart and soul of everything that Marvel had been doing over the past 10 or 15 years, all left to go work at another company because they couldn't stand Jim Shooter. So it was coming to a head, and it did. In 1987, Jim Shooter was fired from Marvel. No matter how successful and popular they'd been, he at that point was considered a bit of a liability. On the same day he was fired, Steve Mazeroski got his license to produce the stage show. So those two basically became, not friends certainly, but partners and started working on other projects. The first project they tried to do was to buy Marvel Comics. They got a bunch of capital and funding together and stuff, made a bid, didn't ultimately happen. Then they tried to buy Harvey Comics. That was the publisher that does Richie Rich and Casper and what have you. Also failed. So they then spent a couple of years working on just building their own company, which they called Voyager Communications or Entertainment. Communication, one or the other. Anyway, one arm of that company was going to be Valiant Comics. Now, the first thing Valiant Comics was doing was license Nintendo comics. Sounded like a fantastic idea. They all lost money. Fans didn't like them because they said the stories in the comics seemed to have nothing to do with what was happening in the games. Why should we buy these? We like playing video games. We're not here necessarily to read comics. So they failed. They lost money. They did WWE comics, wrestling comics. Those apparently lost less money, but they were such a headache to deal with that ultimately they abandoned those. So at this point, they were in trouble. Their money was running out. They were teetering on insolvency already. And then Jim Shooter remembered, hey, I know these guys at Western Publishing. So he went to Western Publishing and arranged a deal to license some of their characters, which included Magnus Robot Fighter, Solar Man of the Atom, and Turok Dinosaur Hunter. Actually, at that point, he was Turok Son of Stone. But come on, dinosaurs. That was the missing ingredient. Anyway, so in 1991, they finally start making money instead of losing money. Now, these books weren't runaway successes by any stretch at this point. But hey, they weren't losing money. They were making money. That's the goal. Magnus Robot Fighter came out. Did pretty well. Solar Man of the Atom. Now, he couldn't get a lot of people necessarily to work at this new company, but two that he could was Bob Layton and Barry Windsor Smith. Now, Barry Windsor Smith is one of my all-time favorite artists. He had done some work at Marvel, not a lot. Well, obviously, he's known for Conan the Barbarian, but that was long pre-Jim Shooter days. But by the time Jim Shooter was there, he did the occasional spot issue of X-Men, spot issue of Iron Man. Didn't do a lot of work, so obviously he didn't necessarily interact all that much with Jim Shooter, but he was one of the most respected artists in the industry. He gave Valiant instant credibility just for having his work. They knew they were the little guys, so they started doing all sorts of things, to try to even the scales. They put coupons in the first handful of issues of Magnus Robot Fighter, cut those coupons out, send them in for Magnus Robot Fighter number 0. These were gimmicks, but slowly but surely they began to work and there was a lot of buzz. Now, at this point, I had a comic shop in California, and I would go to the distributor that was in Oakland at the time, And I would see these books, but they were slowly gaining steam. I would put them in my shop and tell people these are great, and they would buy them, and then I would go get more, and then they would buy them, and I would get more. So it was word of mouth building. It wasn't necessarily an explosion, but it was doing pretty well. Now, starting in 1992, the train starts to really pick up steam. That's when they decided to start making new characters. Now, first off the bat, Jim Shooter had written a movie treatment featuring some characters that were kind of similar to the X-Men. And Paramount was where he took it, and they loved the treatment. But they said, we love the treatment, we love the characters, we love the story. All we want you to do is rewrite it a little bit and make it a comedy because we want to make it and feature Eddie Murphy. Sounds like a great idea. Jim Shooter said, not a chance in hell. So that didn't happen. He kept the property himself. So as 1992 rolls around, he decides to redo it, and it comes out as Harbinger. Now, Harbinger was their first all-new characters, and it laid the foundation for what was going to become the Valiant universe. So even though the Marvel New Universe kind of flopped, the concepts lived on, and now the public was ready for a new universe. Now, following that, they had several characters that premiered: Exo Man of War, Rye. All of these characters started really gaining traction. Again, small increments at a time, word of mouth sales. This was nothing necessarily that was huge, but it was gaining steam. Now, it was gaining steam until this happened, Unity. Because Jim Shooter remembered the whole Secret Wars, the whole Contest of Champions thing, and said, what we need is a cool intercompany crossover to start really tying all these threads we put together into a whole that fans can really sink their teeth into. And boy, did they. All of a sudden, Valiant Comics were really exploding. I was at a comic convention in Sacramento. I was dealing and what have you. And at the end of the show, I remember the dealer behind me had a wall behind him, had a bunch of back issues. And as I'm loading up my stuff to leave and the convention is over, I turn around and I see this crowd, and it looks like the scenes you see at Wall Street with all these guys basically pointing and shouting, give me that copy of Magnus, give me that copy of Solar, give me that copy of Riot. They were basically buying up everything they could. It was a feeding frenzy. It was the first time I had seen it. It was the first time I had really been introduced to what was about to become the 90s. Now, in 1992, Wizard Magazine had all of a sudden become a big thing. Before Wizard Magazine, you had magazines about comics, but they were tiny little niche sellers. Your average comic shop would sell 3 or 4 copies of Amazing Heroes or things like that. All of a sudden, Wizard, which really pushed values and speculation and hot properties, became a huge thing, and it was selling as many copies as almost any comic was selling. Wizard Magazine number 17 had basically 7 of the top 10 sought-after back issues were all Valiant books. They had become that popular, that successful. Also, that same year, Diamond named them Publisher of the Year. They were riding high. They produced Eternal Warrior, Rise Zero, which basically then tied up the entirety of the Marvel Universe. And just to show how big they had gotten, they produced another series called Hardcore. Now, the thing that was so great about Hardcore, or the thing that was important for them, Jim Lee cover. Now, how did this happen? Well, they went to Jim Lee and said, we'd love you to do a cover for this new series. It'll get a lot of attention. And Jim Lee said, guys, I work for Image. No, not interested. Not gonna. No interest whatsoever. Steve Mazereski had entertainment connections. Jim Lee loved U2. U2 was playing in San Diego. Jim Lee could not get tickets. Steve Mazereski said, I got you covered, Jim. Hey, about that cover, could we make it a fold-out? So yeah, all of a sudden, Jim Lee got to see U2. Valiant got a fold-out Jim Lee cover on their new book. They were riding high. So of course, what's going to happen next? Jim Shooter gets ousted from Valiant. Now, it depends on who you ask as to exactly what was going on. It wasn't as simple as they just walked in and fired him. Again, all sorts of behind-the-scenes machinations, power plays. It had a lot to do with money. It had a lot to do with how many people were actually on Jim Shooter's side. Answer, not terribly many. Either way, Jim Shooter was gone, and Bob Layton took over as editor-in-chief. Now, one of the first things Bob Layton did was he and Steve Mazereski agreed no print runs over 500,000 copies. That was a lot. That was a big print run for comics back in those days, huge. They said no more than that, no matter how popular our books are getting. That didn't last long. All of a sudden, we get Bloodshot, 742,000 copies. Now, Math is not my specialty, but 500,000 is less than 742,000. Ryan the Future Force came out, 900,000 copies. Guys, that's getting close to 1 million. Surely they're not going to top 1 million. Bad news, everybody. Turok Dinosaur Hunter, cool, shiny chromium cover, 1,750,000 copies. I'll let that sink in for a moment, but I'm only for a moment because something else needs to sink in. At almost 2 million copies, this was the number 4 selling comic of that month. Not year, month. That was how big the comic market had gotten. Anything that gets that big is just ripe for a bubble to burst. All it needed was just one little push to the domino. Hey everybody, remember Deathmate? It seemed like a great idea. Basically, the people at Image, or at least some of the people at Image and the people at Valiant, were like, we'll do a crossover, it'll feature both, it'll sell in buckets. What could possibly go wrong? Lots. First off, not all the Image founders agreed to be in it. Only Mark Silvestri, Rob Liefeld, and Jim Lee. So there was no Shadowhawk, there was no Spawn, there was no Pitt, or any of those other characters. Second, they were producing the books independently. Now, Valiant was known for doing everything on time. They were a completely different company from Image. Image was a bunch of artists who did things as soon as they could, which was never, ever, ever on time. So Valiant's books came out on time, Image books didn't. And in fact, one of the crucial stories was Bob Layton, who apparently had worked on the prologue, actually flew from New York to Southern California and sat on Rob Liefeld's doorstep until Liefeld would finish the few pages. He only had to do a handful of pages for the Valiant prologue. Finally, he gets them because he's standing right there, takes him to a hotel room in Anaheim, inks them, and flies back to New York. So the Valiant prologue for Deathmate hit the stands on time. And then the 2 Valiant issues hit the stands on time. And then nothing. It not only got so bad, it got so bad that this is the Valiant epilogue for Deathmate. This was supposed to ship before it, but it shipped after. So people got this after the story had already concluded. Everything was over. It was a disaster, an absolute unmitigated disaster. Now, it wasn't responsible for the fall of the comic market, but it played a big part, it and a lot of other things like it. In 1994, basically 40% of the comic shops in America closed. That bubble burst, and it burst really, really hard. So, obviously, Valiant was not doing terribly well at that point. Enter Acclaim. Acclaim was a video game manufacturer, and they were looking around for properties because what they had to do was license properties. Licensing was very, very expensive. So they thought to themselves, comics are huge. We've seen all these huge numbers for comics. We'll buy a company. Nobody knew this at the time. They tried to buy Image first. Image laughed them out of the room. So then they go to Valiant, and they pay $65 million for Valiant. At the time, the company was only worth $30 million. So needless to say, they paid too much. They got some properties, and initially it wasn't that bad. They had pretty good success with the Turok Dinosaur Hunter video game. They did okay with the Shadow Man video game, but very quickly they ran into trouble. However, immediately the comic company ran into trouble. First thing they started was Birthquake. They tried to revitalize their books because sales were falling like crazy. After all, if 40% of the comic shops closed, there's not places to sell your books. And those few places that are there are like, guys, we remember Deathmate. We're not ordering as many of your books anymore. Birthquake didn't happen. Eventually, they stopped all of the Valiant books and relaunched them again in yet another format. Still, total public indifference. People just didn't care anymore. As big and as huge as they'd gotten, they fell, and they fell hard. At that point, it was just a case of coasting out the 90s, which is just as well, because by the time this would all be over, Acclaim would declare bankruptcy, and their products would basically be liquidated. That is almost the end of the Valiant story. It would have been, except since Acclaim went bankrupt and liquidated their properties, there was somebody waiting to buy them, and that's actually another big story in itself. That's what leads us to the Valiant of today. And if we're lucky, maybe we'll get Michael, who is the expert basically on modern day Valiant, to tell you that story. This video is long enough. I've hit you with a lot of information, so I'm going to close about there. But guys, it was a tremendous decade in the Chinese version of the interesting sense. If you lived through the 90s, you knew Deathmate, you knew Valiant, you knew Image. I hope you were there. If you have any particular memories of it, hey, there's comments. Also in our comments, put other things you would like for me to talk about. Ideas, I can use them. Second, these videos now we're having to kind of shift to YouTube. I made the video yesterday at 6 o'clock in the morning, spent 7 or 8 hours trying to get it uploaded to Facebook. It finally would not. So I put it on YouTube. Guys, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You know, like you see all these guys doing, it'll help us out a little bit because at least for the time being, that's where I'm going to have to put them. If you got any other suggestions, man, throw them our way because we're here while you're having to be at home and hopefully read comics and work on your projects. Guys, we're all doing this together. So with that, have a great day. Send those suggestions our way. Take care, guys.